Hi, my name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society and the project coordinator for the Pacific Northwest Bumble Bee Atlas project. Thanks in advance for watching our training webinars. Please note that these webinars were recorded live and included question and answers from the audience. We've edited some of those answers and questions to make this a little bit more straightforward for those of you watching after the fact. Whether you're watching these for the first time or trying to get a refresher, we hope they'll help you learn how to participate in the Pacific Northwest Bumble Bee Atlas and why it's important. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with us via email at bumblebees@xerces.org, or you can find more information on our website. Thanks again for watching. Enjoy the webinar.
All right, so we're done with our introduction. We're going to jump now into sort of a brief overview of bumblebee conservation and ecology. So I told you earlier that there's 3,600 species of bees in North America, north of Mexico. We're focusing just on the bumblebees. So this is going to get into the question of why are we focusing just on bumblebees? One of the reasons that we're just focusing on bumblebees is because they are charismatic microfauna. Most people, when they think about a bumblebee, they have a positive emotion. And you can't say that about too many invertebrates out there. If I was having a sweat bee workshop today or a leafcutter workshop today, there would likely still be some of you there, but not all of you would show up, likely. It's just a different scenario. And so having a species of animals or a group of animals that people are familiar with and have positive thoughts about is really helpful in terms of bringing them in and encouraging them to help with conservation. And on top of that, if we have people that care about and want to conserve bumblebees, their actions are going to help so many other animals as well. So that's an important aspect of it. But on top of that, bumblebees are incredibly important ecologically. They have really unique physiology. They can fly in cold, wet conditions because they have the ability to detach their wings from their flight muscles and actually warm themselves up so they can fly at much lower temperatures than a lot of other species of bees. They're very intelligent and can learn to access resources in unique ways. I'm going to show you a video in a minute here that will help you to understand that. They have uniquely long tongues, which let them visit really diverse flowers that have long corolla tubes. And they're super innovative. They use their strength and their intelligence to access resources that other animals can't. An example of that is buzz pollination. Some plants in the family Solanaceae, which like tomatoes and eggplants and peppers, their pollen is actually fused inside the anthers. And the only way to get that pollen out of the anthers is to vibrate them at a particular frequency. And most species of bees can't do this, but bumblebees can. So what they do is they latch onto the flower with their mouth parts and then vibrate their wings, which creates this frequency which causes the pollen to just come shooting out of the anthers. And then the bee sort of coats her body in that pollen and then grooms it into her pollen carrying baskets called corbicula on the side here. So that's one way that they're innovative. This is a video here which is going to show you how intelligent that bumblebees are. Sorry, it's just going to take me a minute here to get it to play. There we go. So here, this researcher is trying to train this bumblebee to roll that ball inside that yellow circle. And it's doing that by providing a sugar reward when it rolls the ball into that circle. So now the bee has learned that, and after being trained, that bumblebee can perform that task very quickly. And also, quite interesting, they can not only learn from researchers, but they can actually also learn from each other. So one bumblebee can learn to roll balls into the circle just by watching another bumblebee perform the task. And that's a level of learning that we really haven't seen from many other animals. And then this bumblebee is doing calculus. it's figuring out which ball it has to do the least work for to get its floral reward. So it chooses the ball closest to the circle to get its floral reward. Super intelligent animals, despite relatively small brains, obviously. So all of those things put together means that bumblebees are incredibly important pollinators for many of the plants, many of the agricultural plants that you see here: tomatoes, peppers, blueberries, cranberries, clover, squash, melon. I'd also put apples on that list. Bumblebees are really important pollinators for all of those plants. They're also, these are about 10% of plants, or I'm sorry, 8% of plants on the planet benefit from buzz pollination. And this is a list of plants that benefit from buzz pollination. And bumblebees are incredibly important pollinators of all of those species as well. We're going to move on to Bumblebee Ecology. And I'm going to start that with a poll. So I asked you earlier how many species of bees there are in North America. Now the question is, of those 3,600 species of bees, how many of them are bumblebees? One, 10, 30, 50? And this is an about question, it's not exact, but about how many species of bumblebees are there in North America? It's a horse race between 30 and 50. All right. Looks like about 80% of you have responded. Maybe some of you are doing quick Google searching. But there are your results. Most of you said around 50, which is right. We have around 50 species in North America. So good job. We have around, I think there are 47 described species in North America, north of Mexico. And we're really lucky to live in a really high biodiversity area. So in the Pacific Northwest, we have around 25 different species of bumblebees. I'm not sure there's any individual spot where you could find actually 24 or 25 species in them. But throughout the region, there are a lot of species here, which makes bumblebee searching really, really fun. It also makes it really, really difficult because there's so many species that look alike and that we have to keep track of. But it's definitely really, really fun place to live, and we're really lucky because of that. So in North America, as I mentioned, there's 47 species. Most of these species are social colonies that are founded by a single queen. The colonies last 1 year. So the queen only lives for 1 year. We'll go through the life cycle here in a minute. Nests can be quite small or quite large, and this depends on the species, but also within a species, it can vary quite a lot by habitat type and habitat quality, elevation, latitude, all sorts of different factors. Bumblebees nest usually in abandoned rodent burrows, sometimes in bird nests, sometimes in compost piles, and other messy areas, and thatched grasses and rock walls. All kinds of places like that are really important for bumblebee nests. The life cycle, it's a cycle, so it's hard to say where it begins, but we'll start in the spring here. So the life cycle begins in the spring when the bumblebee queen emerges from her hibernacula. She comes out of hibernation at some point in the spring, and spring can be different for different species of bumblebees. We have one species of bumblebee, Bombus melanopygus, that emerges sometimes in January or February. And we have other species of bumblebees that won't emerge until June, or at least May. So it really varies by species when spring is, but generally saying in spring, they emerge and they can spend a couple of weeks looking for nesting sites. It's believed that competition for nesting sites can be quite fierce. And there's some evidence for that as well in the cast of or a subgenus of bumblebees called cuckoo bumblebees that we'll go through in a little bit. And they tend to be, as I said, below ground in abandoned rodent burrows. And then once she has found her nest, she will start to build waxen pots. And she fills those waxen pots with pollen and mixed with nectar to form a little cake. And then she lays her eggs directly on the pollen. And here's what the eggs look like here. And then when those eggs hatch, this is what they look like. They basically are little worms. So this is a baby bee. So cute. And then just like a caterpillar, those baby bees go through complete metamorphosis. So they pupate, and then they emerge as winged adults. And the process from egg to winged adult is around 5 weeks. So it's a 5-week process. When the first cast that comes out are going to be workers, and workers are females. And at that point, the queen will no longer leave the nest. She stays in the nest and focuses on laying eggs and feeding her young, while the workers begin bringing resources into the nest to lay to start the next cast. And then come fall, the bumblebees are near the end of their life cycle. So at that point, the colony switches and starts producing new queens and males. And those new queens will try to find a mate. Usually mating occurs either in the grass or on plants, or sometimes it can happen in the air. Queens tend to mate with just one male, although there are some exceptions. And then after she's mated, she will spend the fall building up fat reserves. So she'll continue to live in the nest, where males will leave the nest and never return. And she will continue to return to the nest and use the colony to help her build up her fat reserves as they continue to feed her. And then when the season nears an end, she will venture out and find a place separate from her natal nest to find a place to hibernate. And those hibernacula we don't know a whole lot about them. In fact, we've started a separate community science project called Queen Quest to learn more about this aspect of their life cycle. So bumblebee queens spend half of their life overwintering, but we know very little about that biology. So this is an animal for which we know quite a bit about, but we don't really know about half of its life cycle, about where it's hibernating, about what conditions are important. And it's very hard to conserve an animal when you don't know, a huge aspect of its life cycle. So we're hoping to learn more about this in the years to come. And then again, she'll stay in that hibernacula for about half of a year, and then emerge the following spring and start her life cycle anew. So this is just a sort of linear look at the life cycle here. Winter time over here, or early spring, you can see a queen emerging from her hibernacula. She searches for a nest site. Once she establishes that nest site, her worker caste comes out on the landscape and brings resources into the nest. And then in the fall, the queen, newly produced queens will mate, and the founder's queen will die in the nest. And then the new queen that hopefully has mated will hibernate under the ground. And this has conservation implications. Most of it is that bumblebees have a tremendously long life cycle. So, from early spring till they're producing the reproductive members of the colony, and then actually overwintering, that can be 16 to 20 weeks. And even if you're out in the middle of summer and there might be 200 or 500 workers of a bumblebee colony in that meadow, they're not going to have successfully reproduced until that queen is in the ground reproducing, or I'm sorry, hibernating. So they have an incredibly long life cycle. And if anything happens to that colony in the interim, let's say, this ground is tilled and it destroys the nest, right before the queen goes out and finds her hibernacula, or if this is mowed and all of those flowering resources go away, and then all of a sudden the queen doesn't have a place to build up fat reserves. All of those things are impacting conservation. And so we really want to think about how we're managing the land and doing the best job we can to ensure that we're considering the life cycle of bumblebees and other bees when we are doing things like burning and other management that we need to do to our natural landscapes. There's also a really interesting aspect of bumblebee ecology, which are these cuckoo bumblebees that we've been talking about a little bit already. Cuckoo bumblebees are kind of like cuckoo birds, and that they don't create their own nests. They actually invade the nest of other species. And so these queens emerge quite a bit later than other species, and they try to find the nest of another bumblebee. And then the female cuckoo bumblebee will go into the nest and will try to kill the foundress queen, and then make the rest of the workers that are there already her slaves and make them do work for her. So they'll continue to bring resources back into the nest, but they will only raise her young and no longer have any, they will no longer raise the eggs or the larvae of the foundress queen. And this is important because this animal, the cuckoo bumblebee, doesn't lay or doesn't raise any workers. All of her offspring are going to be reproductive members. They're going to be reproductive females or males. She doesn't have any workers, so she's fully dependent on the worker caste of the host bee to gather all of her resources. So she has to invade this nest early enough so that there aren't so many workers that can help the queen defend the nest, but it has to be late enough that there actually is a worker caste. So it's a bit of a tricky biology there, and an interesting, certainly an interesting ecology to think about. That's a really brief overview of bumblebee ecology. I'm sure there are questions, and I could go into a lot more detail, but that's a broad brush of what we know about bumblebee ecology. I'm now going to talk about bumblebee conservation and bumblebee decline, and why we have, what we understand about that. So bumblebees are in decline, or we know, I shared with you earlier that around a quarter of them are. I'm going to back up a little bit and just sort of tell a little conservation story, if I can. And just that our original understanding of bumblebee conservation comes from Robin Thorpe, the man that I mentioned in Module 1, and those baseline data sets that he was gathering in Oregon and Oregon and California. And the two species that he was looking at or tracking over time were these two species: the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, and Franklin's bumblebee, Bombus franklini. And these are the two species that completely disappeared from his field sites in the mid-1990s. And at that time, he raised the red flag and said, hey, what's going on? And sure enough, in the eastern United States, these two species, the yellow-banded bumblebee and the rusty-patched bumblebee, were also in significant decline. So at that time, with the help of Dr. Thorpe and a bunch of other scientists across the globe, the Xerces Society helped to found the Bumblebee Specialist Group, which is a part of the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, whose role is to assess the extinction risk of all taxa on the planet. And so we're responsible, the Bumblebee Specialist Group is responsible for assessing the extinction risk of all bumblebees. And every area that you see on this map that has color on it, that is not gray, has native bumblebees. And those are the areas that we're trying to target to do these extinction risk analyses. We've conducted analyses in the South, in South America, Mesoamerica, and North America. I'm the Red List authority for this group, so I'm the one who conducted these assessments with the help of other researchers. And as I shared with you earlier, we found that around a quarter of them in North America, and actually in Meso and South America as well, around a quarter of them are facing some degree of extinction risk. And so why is it that some of our species are in decline and seem to be in trouble, while others of them seem to be doing fine. In order to address that question, we need to start thinking about what the threats are on the landscape and how they might only apply to some species. As I mentioned earlier, the threats that are out there for bumblebees are vast and varied. On top of all of it is a really unique genetic situation that is true for bumblebees. So bumblebees and other members of the Hymenoptera exhibit something that we call single loci sex determination, or a haplodiploidy. And I could give a genetic lecture about this, but the take home is that bumblebees and other Hymenoptera are uniquely susceptible to what we call inbreeding. And so therefore, when populations get small, the effects of inbreeding or the effects of mating with someone that's closely related to you are much greater. The impacts are much greater on bumblebee populations than they would be on other animals. And when we compound that genetic factor with the landscape of pesticides and changing food supplies and climate change, you get a really unique interaction that's that's troublesome for bumblebees and may make it difficult for them to recover from as well. So some of those threats, to go into a little bit more detail, is we've taken grasslands and prairies that once looked like this and provided flowering resources for those 16 to 20 weeks, and we've converted them into agricultural fields that only provide flowering resources for a couple of weeks. And that's just not long enough to support a bumblebee population. Likewise, we've taken brownfield cities and we're converting them into green grass. And green grass, unfortunately, does not support, is not really habitat for almost any species. So unless we're doing a better job of creating habitat in our urban areas, we're going to continue to see declines in bees and other pollinators. This is a map that shows the usage of a highly toxic insecticide in North America. This is the product called imidacloprid that was introduced in the mid-1990s and whose use has grown exponentially over the last 25 years or so, to the point now where most of our grasslands and prairies, in addition to becoming agricultural land, which already didn't support bumblebees, are now laden with a highly toxic insecticide. And these insecticides are not only highly toxic, they're also what we call systemic, which means that they are water soluble, and they're not only absorbed by the target plant, but they also get into the water table and can be absorbed by plants nearby as well, such that you can get pretty significant drift of these chemicals. And because it's water soluble, and systemic, it means that it's actually absorbed by the plant and expressed in every cell that water moves in and out of, which means that we're going to find these insecticides not only in the plant tissues, but also in the pollen and in the nectar. And that means that anytime a bee is drinking nectar or eating pollen from a plant that's been treated with an insecticide, it's going to get a micro dose of that insecticide. And it may not be a lethal dose, but it very likely is a sublethal dose at a point or at a level that still has impacts. So what we see with these sublethal doses of insecticides is bumblebees lose their efficiency to forage. They spend longer time out on the landscape looking for flowers and come back with less pollen. Their ability to reproduce decreases. So these things over time are going to have lasting population level changes for bumblebees and other pollinators. The map that you see here is only agricultural usage. It does not consider urban or household use. And so that is a problem because these chemicals are still widely available. You can go to almost any home improvement store or nursery and buy the same highly toxic chemicals directly off the shelf and use them in your backyard, or your neighbor may be using them in their backyard. And this is an example of a application of these chemicals that happened in Oregon in 2013. So the tree that you see in this picture in the foreground is a European linden tree, and they bloom in mid-June. Actually, they usually bloom during pollinator week, which is an irony to this story. But these trees have so many flowers, and they attract bees from likely, tens of miles away. Bees will fly a long way to go to visit these trees. And these trees also attract aphids, unfortunately. And aphids are known to sort of drop honeydew. So there were 62 of these trees in this parking lot, and the land manager hired a company to come in and treat these trees for aphids, so that they wouldn't drop sugar water on people's cars. And when they came to treat these trees, they used one of these highly toxic insecticides, and they sprayed 62 trees that were in full bloom and full of pollinators, with these highly toxic insecticides. I was on site the day after the application, and bumblebees were literally raining from the trees and falling on the ground dead. Every black dot that you can see in this map here or in this photograph is a dead bumblebee. And you can zoom in and just look at the density all over. And so the density was pretty similar across all 62 of the trees that were in this parking lot. It was a really remarkable thing to be a part of. And there was no reason to use a highly toxic insecticide in this case. This was an ornamental setting. There was no economic threshold. Sugar water easily rinses off, washes off of cars, and aphids can be treated using water. There was no reason to use this highly toxic insecticide. And this continues to go on. We get reports of applications to these trees every year right around pollinator week. So this is continuing to happen, and urban use of these products is just as bad, if not worse, than agricultural areas. On top of those major issues, we also have climate change, which is driving major changes in bumblebees and changing phenology patterns and shortening our summers and making them hotter and drier, and changing fire patterns, which are also changing the landscape. On top of that, we are, in the mid-1990s, we learned how to grow bumblebees in boxes. So we like tomatoes, and we have since, because we like to eat tomatoes, and we like to have them in February, we have learned how to grow tomatoes in greenhouses year-round. And bumblebees, as I told you earlier, because they can buzz pollinate, are fantastic pollinators of tomatoes. And so the industry created a novel solution to a novel problem by learning how to grow bumblebees in a laboratory and then shipping colonies, full colonies of those bumblebees throughout the world to these greenhouses. And unfortunately, these greenhouses are not sealed. So wild bumblebees can fly from the outside in, and the commercial bumblebees can fly from the inside out. And then these bumblebees actually interact with each other. And what we learned is that while these bumblebees were grown in laboratories, they developed some sort of resistance to this fungal pathogen called Nosema bombi. And then as these bumblebees were shipped all over the country, or all over the world really, those infected bumblebees then interacted with our wild bumblebees and spread that disease and amplified it to unsuspecting and unprotected bumblebees that didn't have the same level of resistance. And that amplification and moving of pathogens throughout North America has likely led to the decline of many of our species in North America. And it has likely led to the listing of the rusty patch bumblebee as an endangered species in the eastern United States, and to Franklin's bumblebee as an endangered species in the western United States, or at least as a proposed endangered species. It's been proposed by the Fish and Wildlife Service and is due to become an officially listed species at the end of this calendar year. So hopefully that's the most depressing part of our presentation. The rest of the day, we're going to focus on what we can do to conserve these animals and why that's important. And one of the great things I think generally about pollinator conservation is that there is something that we can do. Pretty much everything that I just described is a man-made problem, which means that we can create a man-made solution or a person-made solution to these problems. And so we can do things to make the world a better place. So one of the things that I've done is with some of my colleagues here at Xerces, I wrote this book called Conserving Bumblebees. which talks about land management. When you signed up for this webinar, you were hopefully given a link that would take you to a page that has a lot of these resources, including these guidelines on it. And perhaps someone on the team could share that link with you now in the chat box. We've distributed, basically what this book does, Conserving Bumblebees, is it lays out the bumblebee life cycle and talks about how to conduct land management with the bumblebee life cycle in mind. It also has plant recommendations by region and some regional bumblebee identification guides as well. And we've distributed this to landowners all over, or land managers all over the country. The gist of the book talks about creating habitat and how to make habitat better. And habitat is pretty simple. And I'm not going to go into great detail today because that's a webinar in and of itself. In fact, Katie and I did a webinar on this this past Thursday, and you can find that webinar on the Xerces YouTube channel if you want to learn more about creating habitat. But basically, it means four things. We need to put food out on the landscape, and that food needs to be in the form of high quality pollen and high quality nectar, and it needs to be on the landscape from spring through fall. We also need to create safe places for bumblebees to shelter, including nesting and overwintering habitat. And then we need to connect those habitats to each other so that bumblebees can find the shelter, and then so that different nesting bumblebees can find each other to mate. And then on top of that, we need to do a better job of not using toxic insecticides for bees. We need to protect them and remove those toxic chemicals from our ornamental landscapes. Just quickly, nest sites are really just your excuse to be lazy in your yard. Leave some unmowed areas, leave some brush piles, encourage a little uncompness, even if it's just in your backyard. This will provide areas for bumblebees to nest. And then we also want to think about overwintering. So we really encourage people to leave leaves in their yard. Those leaves and pine needle duff can provide really important insulation for bumblebees. So leaving some access to bare ground, and then also leaving leaves on top of that bare ground as insulation provides ample places, hopefully, for bumblebees to overwinter until we learn more about those habitats. Finally, I want to end this conservation section by just talking briefly about honeybees. I think over the last 20 years, awareness about pollinators and pollinator decline has increased rapidly. And the solution to a lot of that from a lot of people has unfortunately been to become a beekeeper. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be a beekeeper. It's a fantastic hobby. Honeybees are beautiful animals, and you can learn a lot from them. They're great educational tools, and they're fascinating to watch and to have in your backyard. But being a beekeeper is not bee conservation. Being a beekeeper is like having a pet. The analogy has been said many times, but having bees in your backyard for conservation is like having birds in your backyard for bird conservation. I mean, having chickens in your backyard for bird conservation. We don't have chickens for conservation, right? We have chickens because we want eggs and because they're beautiful animals and we want to be around them. It's the same thing with honeybees. They're a non-native animal. They give us honey, which is great, and they're beautiful, fascinating animals. And if that's the reason that you want to be a beekeeper, that's fantastic. But we have evidence that shows that honeybees are interacting with wild bees and changing pollinator networks. They're competing with them for resources. And there's also evidence that they're transmitting diseases to native bees as well. And so, we already have a stressed landscape, and increasing more honeybees on the landscape is not going to improve things for our native bees. It may have the opposite effect of making it more challenging. So again, be a beekeeper for the right reason, but don't be a beekeeper for conservation.